Dear colleagues, dear students, dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the opening of this semester's Ruperto Carola lecture series. The biannual lecture series has become an important and very well-established format at Heidelberg University. Together with accompanying formats such as exhibitions, it brings timely and societally highly relevant research questions into public discussion. Examples were the past lecture series on artificial intelligence or on Germany and Europe prior to and after the end of the Second World War 80 years ago. Bringing scientific discourse and scholarly debate into the public reflects an important aspect of our understanding as a university. We have a responsibility to engage with society, to contribute knowledge and orientation, and to create spaces for dialogue and respectful discussions. As a comprehensive research university, Heidelberg brings together many disciplines and perspectives, and we are convinced that many complex challenges of our time can only be understood and addressed through dialogue across disciplines and through engagement with society. This conviction shapes our strategy as a university, a strategy that aims to strengthen interdisciplinary research on the foundation of very strong disciplines. The topic of this semester's lecture series is certainly one of utmost complexity: resistant democracy, resilience, security, and defense. Democracies across the world are facing profound challenges. We see growing populism and political radicalization. We see disinformation and conspiracy narratives undermining trust in institutions, in expertise, and sometimes even in democratic processes themselves. At the same time, geopolitical tensions and societal insecurities are increasing pressure on open societies. These developments raise difficult questions. How can democratic societies defend themselves without compromising the very openness and freedom they seek to protect? How resilient are our institutions? And what strengthens social cohesion in times of uncertainty and division? These are not questions for a single discipline alone. They concern law and political sciences, history and sociology, psychology, and communication studies, amongst many other disciplines. This lecture series therefore brings together researchers from different disciplinary backgrounds to reflect on the future of democratic coexistence from multiple perspectives. It is precisely this plurality of perspectives that universities can contribute to society. And I believe this contribution matters greatly today. Universities depend on democratic freedom, on freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and academic freedom. At the same time, democracies depend on participation, and this requires places that encourage critical reflection, evidence-based debate, and openness to different perspectives. This reciprocal relationship between democracy and academia is something we should never take for granted. Today's lecture marks the beginning of a broader conversation that will continue throughout the summer semester. Following this opening event with Professor Borbáth, 7 further lectures by 6 scholars from Heidelberg and 1 from Tübingen will address topics ranging from the constitutional foundations of defensive democracy to historical parallels to contemporary crisis and the social effects of conspiracy theories. All lectures will take place on Mondays at 6:15 p.m. here in the Great Lecture Hall of our university. For those unable to attend in person, Recordings of the lecture will later be available through HiOnline, Heidelberg University's central platform for digital lectures and events. It is now my pleasure to briefly introduce today's speaker, Junior Professor Dr. Endre Borbáth, who is Junior Professor for Empirical Analytical Participation Research here at Heidelberg University. He is also an Eminente Research Group leader with the topic The New Climate Divide. His research combines comparative political and His research combines comparative politics and political sociology to study political participation, protest, party competition, democracy, and climate-related mobilization in Europe. Using quantitative and mixed methods approaches, he analyzes media data, surveys, and survey experiments to understand how transformation in European conflict structures shape both collective and individual political action. Before joining Heidelberg University, he held positions at the Freie Universität Berlin and at the Berlin Social Sciences Center WZB. He received his PhD from the European University Institute. Dear Professor Borbáth, we are very pleased that you are opening this lecture series today, and I very much look forward to your lecture. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, a warm welcome also from me for everybody who made the time to spend this Monday afternoon here with me, with us, and thank you for your interest in the topic. Thank you also for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I very much appreciate the opportunity to open this lecture series. So why are we here? Why do we want to discuss about the populist radical right? This is a party family, a political force that only a generation ago was more or less a marginal phenomena in most of Europe, in most European countries. In contrast, we see it today. In some countries, they are in government. In even more countries, they are represented in parliament. And in even more places, they mobilize on the street and they are present in general media discussions and public debates. Here, I just brought you one figure to illustrate the rise of the populist radical right parties that shows the average vote share across elections in Northwestern Europe, in Southern Europe, and in Central and Eastern Europe. And you see that despite the variation around these trend lines, these parties have really risen very increasingly so especially since the so-called Great Recession, the economic crisis after 2008 and 2009, and the following Eurozone crisis, migration crisis, and this long decade of crisis in Europe, to the extent that by now across Western, Southern, and Central and Eastern Europe, they represent more or less a 20% vote share large party family across the board, of course, with quite some variation in all of these regions and with quite some differences in the speed with which they have emerged. So, for example, we see that in Southern Europe, this has been a much kind of more sudden phenomena than in the East, where to a great extent they have been present since the 1989 regime change. What do I want to speak to you about today? I want to answer 4 questions or engage with 4 questions. First, to define the phenomena that we are talking about. What is the populist radical right? Then I want to talk about where does it come from, how to understand its rise, and how do these parties mobilize support to become this successful? And ultimately, when do they actually threaten democracy? What is the relationship to democracy, the topic of the lecture series this semester? And the key argument that I would like to make is that the populist radical right parties actually are rooted in a socio-economic cleavage. They are structurally rooted in society, and to the extent that they are a threat to democracy, that this threat depends on the extent to which they represent anti-pluralist claims to power. And I will speak about this more as I come to it. But starting with what is actually the populist radical right. This seems very much like disciplinary conceptual debate, which we as social scientists or as political scientists, we like to talk about concepts. And oftentimes we use these concepts a bit interchangeably in the public discourse: far right, populism, radical right, extreme right. And we don't think too much about whether these concepts are really interchangeable or do they actually mean something else. And here the argument would be that they all point to something different related to this phenomena, and they are not actually easily interchangeable. And this is not just a disciplinary conceptual debate, but it also has relevance for the public discourse to the extent that these concepts help us clarify which are the actors that only want to change the status quo and which are the actors that actually threaten democracy. So behind these conceptual debates are different types of understanding of these actors. So the populist radical right as a party family, I think, or this literature, also in the tradition of this literature, is distinguished traditionally from the extreme right, to the sense that the populist radical right accepts some kind of conception of democracy that is often very majoritarian, very much rooted in procedures, and very much rooted in elections. Elections as the centerpiece of democracy, and it's not a liberal understanding of democracy. So it does not believe or it does not advocate for minority rights, it does not advocate for checks and balances, it advocates for majority power in democracies. And this is different than what the extreme right represents. The extreme right is an undemocratic force. It does not believe in the idea of popular sovereignty or that the nation as a carrier of kind of popular sovereignty the majority should decide the fate of the country or of politics. So these are quite different party families, but they are both part of the far right, what we call as far right as an umbrella term. And while analytically it makes sense to make this distinction, actually empirically what we see is blurring boundaries, increasingly blurring boundaries between the populist radical right and between the extreme right. So where the extreme starts and where the populist radical right ends, empirically is not such an easy question to answer if one goes into the cases. And of course, these two party families also share common elements. And they share common elements first and foremost in the ideology that they represent. So they both stand for some form of nativism and authoritarianism. And I want to talk about more what this actually is. So what we mean by nativism in political science, it means a very strong belief that the country and the institutions of the country should actually be ruled by the ethnic conceived nation. So the nation is very much rooted in an ethnic view, in a culturalist view of what it means to be Hungarian, what it means to be Polish, what it means to be German, and only this group of people should have the claim to rule politics in the respective country. That is kind of what nativism as an ideology means. Authoritarianism as an ideology, what it means is very much an understanding of society that is rooted in law and order, in a strictly ordered society, in a belief of social order, where deviance, kind of deviance from the social order, in any kind of deviance is punished. Be that kind of ethnic minority, be that religious minority, be that sexual minority, be that in any kind of minority, is very strictly kind of stigmatized. And then there is populism, which is a moral antagonism between the people and the elite. So we think about this in the context of very people-centered discourses that are against the elite. We, the people, against the ones on the top, against the elite that rule us. Whereas kind of nativism and authoritarianism are thick ideologies in the sense that they have this ambition to give encompassing answers to many questions that one might have in public policymaking, that they give kind of priorities or answers to trade-offs that parties face in parliament or in government. Populism is much more of a thin ideology in the sense that it is not kind of coming with this demand to answer all questions that might arise in politics. It's not the type of ideology like liberalism, socialism, or nativism, or authoritarianism that tries to kind of provide a holistic understanding of the social world or of politics. So populism as a thin ideology needs a host ideology that it attaches itself to. And on the right, as I mentioned, this is very much nativism and authoritarianism. But populism is not only a right-wing phenomena. It is also a phenomena that left-wing forces use to some extent, depending on the country and depending on the time period. We see, for example, discourses like maybe the Occupy Wall Street movement, we are the 99% against the 1% who are exploiting us. So this type of populist discourses are rooted in a different host ideology, a different kind of tick ideology, so to say, that is very much centered on economic redistribution, on class conflict, on the role of the state in the economy. So in this sense, my argument would be that populism is not so much the explanation for the rise of these parties or the success of these parties, much more of a symptom for the underlying conflict that these parties represent. And if you get this far in the argumentation, the next question is, what actually is the conflict that these parties represent? In other words, where do the populist radical right parties come from, and is this actually a socially, economically embedded conflict that these parties are representing in politics? And here, to understand this conflict and to put kind of populism in perspective, the idea would be that populism is more a device that amplifies the conflict, that attaches itself to conflict, but it's not related to the substance of the conflict. To think about the substance of the conflict, we in political science or in sociology or in political sociology, I see my students here, I know they know this, we often think of cleavage theory. Cleavage theory as the classical understanding of how conflict is being studied in the social sciences. Because this type of theoretical framework gives us a language to understand these long-term historical antagonisms that we see in societies across the board unfolding. And the key idea here is that these conflicts are rooted in sociological differences that we can observe. We can observe higher education, lower education. We can observe gender. We can observe occupation. We can observe many of these sociological indicators that make these conflicts socially embedded. They are also rooted in ideational discourses, in normative understandings about society. So groups that think differently about what is the public good, what is the direction that the country should take, what is the direction which politics should be headed to. And they are ultimately rooted in different political loyalties, in different kind of organizations that represent different poles of the cleavage. Populist radical right parties, green parties, social democratic parties versus liberal parties and so on. And what is also important for this cleavage understanding of the word, that ultimately conflict originates from social transformation that is reflected by politics. It's not the other way around, that politics brings conflict into society. Here, conflict is very much the result of broad social transformation as opposed to political entrepreneurs who mobilize in a top-down fashion and create conflict around a political project that they represent. In terms of kind of traditional understandings of conflicts, there are these two authors that we always study in my seminar, Martin Lipset and Stein Rokkan, who talk about two historical processes of how European societies form these historical antagonisms. And one has to do with nation-building processes, how nation-states came about and got formed in European countries. And here, kind of, whether you were in the center of the nation-building process or more in the periphery, whether you were, for example, during the French Revolution, whether one was in France or more kind of in the provinces, that had a very strong effect on the cleavage in which one was embedded in. Or also in religion. Should the state be a secular state, or should it represent much more of a religious understanding of the word? So that's nation building. A second kind of historical process that has been incredibly important for the development of cleavages in European politics is industrialization, the so-called Industrial Revolution. And here the obvious cleavage is class. Are you the owner or are you the worker? Who has the means of production? We know this has been with some measure, the most consequential conflict in European politics and the most historically rooted. And the second then is about centers of industrial innovation. Is this kind of an urban locality, a city, or is this kind of the countryside that is not so strongly linked to the overall kind of chains of production and industrial development? So these are kind of historical cleavages that have been around for a long time and come as a result of this broad kind of historical transformations that European societies went through. But here the argument would be that in recent decades, we are actually living through another transformation that is creating a new cleavage in society and splits society in some way. And this transformation have to do with globalization, the dismemberment of national economies, of the role of the state as the only kind of actor that rules nation states, that countries as such or nation states as such become much more intertwined. And with globalizations, there is much more linkage between these units. And issues like globalization, immigration, or European integration in this global kind of order creates new winners and losers, creates new distributive conflicts that splits society in ways that were not there in the past. And this creates a cultural conflict that becomes autonomous to some extent from the class conflict. It splits society differently than class conflict have split society in the past. This is what we mean with the cultural axis, with the identity politics, all of these terms that nowadays we use to understand this type of opposition or this type of antagonisms. The substance of this conflict is very much an open, integrated society versus a closed, demarcated society. And we oftentimes live with this kind of simplification that one has to do with the economy, that is class, and the other has to do with culture, and that is identity. And I would argue that's a mistaken understanding of this new conflict structure. It's not so much that it's not economic, it's just not redistributive. It's not about the role of the state in the economy. It's much more whether one wants to be embedded in transnational chains of productions, transnational supply chains, or one wants to be isolated from this and wants a strong state that protects, for example, in labor market risks or in all kinds of risks that come from being embedded in a globalized economy. And people who are kind of on the winning side of this transformation, who want an integrated, open society, they are very often represented by green parties. And that's also how this pole of this axis has traditionally been called, or is often called in this literature, the green alternative libertarian forces. And people who are kind of on the losing side of this transformation, who don't want an open society or an open kind of chain of production in the country to be embedded in, who don't want the global competition, they are represented by the populist radical right parties, by TAN parties, traditional authoritarian nationalist forces. How does this kind of conflict, this type of cleavage come about? It is the result of historical processes. And one kind of transformation that is kind of the first, so to say, one wave of transformation has to do with 1968 and the legacy of 1968. The new social movements, the kind of politicization of conflicts that were previously not seen as political, and bringing them into politics. For example, female emancipation, for example, the liberation of sexual minorities, things like this. And this type of agenda is very much picked up by green parties, that is the progressive, the TAN pole of this axis. And the other pole, from the 1990s onwards, is mobilized by the populist radical right, the losers of this transformation, the losers of globalization processes. And in comparison to the TAN pole of this axis, this is much more of a party-centered story, much less kind of has to do with movement, civil society, with bottom-up mobilization dynamics. Oftentimes the party, the populist radical right, stages this conflict, appears kind of on the streets in the lens of party-sponsored protest. The party is in the driving seat. It's not that there is movement mobilization and the party represents that, rather that the party presents itself in various aspects of civil society or of movement politics, street mobilization. This is once more showing this, I don't know if you see the figure well, but this is once more showing what I just mentioned before at the beginning of the talk. So here on the first facet of this figure, you see the vote share of the green and radical right parties. The dark line would be the radical right parties, and the dashed gray light would be the green parties. And you see how these parties were nowhere on the map, so to say, in the 1970s, in the 1980s. The party system of the 1970s and of the 1960s was very similar to the party system that were formed at the end of the Second World War, politics was frozen, so to say, between historical oppositions centered on the classical cleavages of European politics. And then these parties come in this two wave of the transformation, starting from the 1970s in the aftermath of the 68 movement, and especially on the populist radical right, we see this spectacular rise of this political force. In terms of the issues driving this transformation, this is the second kind of facet here. This comes from newspaper data. So we analyze kind of the issues that are represented by these political parties during the campaign period, as reflected by two national newspapers across 6 northwestern European countries, going back to the 1970s up until the present. The figure only goes to 2015, but the data goes to the present. And what you see here is a very strong rise of these conflicts related to globalization, immigration, and European integration. The other kind of cultural issues, cultural liberalism and the environment, these are embedded in the previous cultural axis, and these are very strongly represented by Green parties, and they represent around 20% of campaigns on average in Northwestern Europe, whereas the immigration and European integration was nowhere in the 70s, and it becomes also 20% of campaign coverage by the present moment, so to say. In the present, probably it's even more than 20. But you also see here is the position that the party system takes on this on average, so notwithstanding the variance across parties, just the average position in the party system. And you see that Northwestern European party systems lean in the progressive direction in terms of the environment and cultural liberalism, and lean in the regressive direction in terms of immigration and European integration. So if these conflicts are politicized, this is where we see kind of, to some extent, not only the populist radical right, but of the normalization of these parties by kind of mainstream parties representing a more regressive position on these issues. But of course, given that these are historical processes, it very strongly depends on where one is on the map. And it depends where we are in Europe, how this unfolds. So even in Northwestern Europe, the countries that have the most organic kind of political development after the Second World War, it makes sense to distinguish countries that have experienced the rise of populist radical right parties much earlier. And here kind of the frontrunners, so to say, in quotation marks, have been France with Le Pen and the Front National, has been Switzerland with the Swiss People's Party, has been Austria with the FPÖ. And then there are other countries in Northwestern Europe where these type of parties are very much more late developments, so much more recent, so to say. And Germany, for example, with the rise of the AfD, but one can also think of, for example, the UK with UKIP that have entered politics at a much later point, nowadays also with the Reform Party, but are incredibly important in these party systems. In Central and Eastern Europe, the story is quite different. In these countries, this Gal-Tan cleavage has always been more salient than in the West, partially because the class conflict was never fully institutionalized. The welfare states were not there to protect these countries from the risks that a global economy brings. So ultimately, politics centers on the Gal-Tan conflict. But in these cases, cleavages and historical opposition stabilize much later. So these are much more volatile party systems. And oftentimes they stabilize under a populist incumbent. If one thinks of Poland under Kaczynski or of Orban under Hungary, this is kind of the context in which oppositions or antagonisms stabilize in the party systems. And if one thinks of Southern Europe, that's again a quite different story. After the fall of Franco and Salazar and the Greek junta and so on, here we see that these countries have traditionally been emigration countries. People were leaving, not coming, not immigration countries. And the rise of the populist radical right is a much more recent phenomenon that oftentimes happened in the shadow, in the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis. And by now these parties, for example, Vox in Spain or Chega in Portugal, are very big parties, command quite large electorates, but their rise is much more recent compared to the developments in Northwestern Europe. The story here is that seen from this perspective, from a cleavage perspective, the populist radical right parties are not so much a deviation, so to say, from politics, are not so much a protest party. It's much more kind of sociologically and economically embedded force that represents one pole of this new kind of Gal-Tan cleavage that results from the transformation of European societies and economies. So that's kind of the embedding of the parties, but we also should understand how do these parties mobilize and how do they become so successful. Sorry. And here I want to point out the importance of one kind of key concept, which is movementization, the relationship with social movements and civil society. If we think of a classical political party, let's say a social democratic party or a Christian democratic party, this is very much an organization that asks for votes, that tries to channel interest through elections, this importance of elections. Elections are centrally important, and speaks of as one organization among many. It doesn't have this claim to be the organization within a field of organization that represents the whole kind of network. If you think of a movementized party, a party that blurs the distinctions between being a political party and a social movement, this is an organization that not only mobilizes for elections, but also regularly stages protests, stages rallies, and also gathers its constituents very kind of successfully or with very big invested effort online. So the role of digital communication is incredibly important for these movementized parties. It's also kind of, in this case of movementization, we see the dramatization of language. Politics is presented as a fight between the people and the elite. A fight for the people, by the people, against the elite that is imagined to be on top and ruling the people. And what is also important is that these parties don't just kind of claim representation as one organization. They claim representation in the name of this community. That's why I try to argue with far right as an umbrella concept, that this means that they blur kind of the distinction between civil society movement and appear kind of as the representation of this broad set of satellite organizations. With movementization, I believe it's very important to understand the rise of populist radical right parties, because it allows these parties to turn electoral support not only into votes and into electoral support as such, but into claims for national sovereignty. Voting for these parties means supporting national sovereignty. That is kind of the claim that these parties make. And why does it fit especially the profile of this populist radical right party's movementization? Here I think I would like to look at this a bit from the perspective of the ideological supply that these parties represent. So from the perspective of populism, movementization as a mobilizational device is very fitting to present kind of politics as a fight between the people versus the elite. And it's also very fitting to present kind of how this would look like in a movement. So to show politics in an embodied way, how kind of this would function within the context of this political party. From the perspective of nativism, of nationalism, movementization and this dramatization of language, kind of borrowing the social movement repertoire, allows in a very kind of dramatic way to show what would it mean for the nation to be under threat, to argue that the nation is under threat from immigrants, from foreigners, from enemies, etc. And by organizing these rallies and taking over this symbolic language, symbolic stage, it's also very fitting to draw boundaries between those who are with us versus those who are not with us, who are not part of our collective kind of action that they are undertaking. And importantly, it's also very fitting to underscore the outsider status of these parties, the anti-establishment appeal that these parties formulate, even though kind of the protest that these parties represent is very much, after all, embedded in the electoral process, and it's there to kind of raise support, it is still kind of underscore the outsider status of these parties. So in effect, kind of movementization contributes towards the populist radical right, performing the idea that society is already mobilized behind it. It's not just a 20% party, it's the true voice of society. Society is already mobilized behind it. That is kind of the claim that they make, and that is kind of the movementization device that it gives to some extent substance or tools to perform that claim, not only kind of say it. What are kind of the components of movementization, or how does this happen? On the one hand, I would like to underscore the brand of political parties and of the discursive environment that these parties are embedded in. We see in our research that less and less political parties are willing to call themselves a party anymore. Parties don't like to be called parties. They like to be called something else. We are, for example, the Five-Star Movement, or we are, for example, the Alternative for Germany, or we are, for example, the National Rally. We are not just a part of society. We are not just a part of politics. We are kind of a movement that is much bigger than the part. And one can think here of many examples how the populist radical right nearly always avoids this label of calling itself a party. And it's not just kind of the name of the party, it's also the discourse that it represents. Kind of regularly taking over social movement type of language and representing that in how the party speaks and in how it presents itself in kind of public discourses. A second component, of course, is action. What do these parties do? How do they organize? And we are beyond the time when a politician went to the TV and in the evening news tried to ask for support from the people. It's very much based on action. It's very much based on protest, street mobilization, rallies, and also digital mobilization, very importantly. And here I think the key example that probably all of us would think of right now are the MAGA rallies of Trump in the US, getting everybody into a stadium and having these huge, huge rallies. But we see the same in Europe, kind of party-sponsored protest, getting supporters on the street, doing something together, this action component. And then finally the organization. Going beyond or kind of deconstructing this traditional way of how political parties are organized. That I'm the member, then there is the chapter, then there's the chapter president, the national president, and so on. We see here the very strong importance of local presence, locally embedded politics, being present in local communities. Whereas kind of mainstream parties are having difficulties to maintain a local organizational presence across Europe, these parties invest into recruiting all kinds of activists and volunteers to bring conflict into the local context where people live. And this also happens through kind of the colonization or the occupation of civil society, organizing in civil society, recognizing the importance of civil society not as a third actor independent of the state and of the market, but as a place of mobilization where these parties can establish themselves. If you think of sports clubs, football clubs, also of religious organizations, how these type of get-together places that were traditionally not linked to party politics can be turned as an instrument for the support of this political party. One example would be, for example, the Lega network in Italy or the Fidesz civic circles in Hungary, but one can also think of various examples from Germany. And here it's also important, from an organizational perspective, the strong importance attached to loyal media organizations, establishing their own media, establishing their own kind of amplifying device that uncritically takes up the messages and amplifies that broader in society. So we see kind of challenging or going much beyond the traditional way of how political parties are organized. And much of that, I would argue, comes from this movement perspective, from this social movement perspective. And importantly, parties are able to borrow these elements without taking over the whole menu, so to say. One should imagine this as a bit like a menu, like a modular type of concept. So we only see very few political parties that go all the way and they don't call themselves a party and they organize protest and they do this kind of organizational innovation. But parties pick and choose, and some elements of this we see across the board, especially being adopted by populist radical right parties. So is this anti-democratic actually, this movementization too? And here the argument would be that one can do this in a pluralist and in an anti-pluralist way. And the kind of key difference is whether the opposition, the political opponents, are recognized as legitimate rivals, or are they kind of depicted and shown as kind of traitors to the nation as illegitimate type of political competition. If it's a pluralist type of movementization, it allows parties to reconnect with society. It allows to bring conflict to, in a socially embedded way, close to people, and to bring kind of society more into politics. And it also allows to channel this type of actions like protest or rallies and so on into kind of electoral competition, to re-establish this connection between society and the political party. If it's anti-pluralist, it's a very effective device to claim exclusive ownership over the representation of quote-unquote the people. It's also kind of an effective device to turn opponents, minorities, and media into enemies. The media elite, the minorities, the opponents, they are not just kind of loyal opposition, but they are kind of the enemies that the people, the supporters, the populist radical right, the movement has to kind of win over. And in this kind of anti-pluralist dynamic, compromise becomes a swear word, something that these parties are very much against, and something that is not seen as a legitimate way of doing politics. And in proportional electoral systems that are built on compromise, this is a big problem for policy making. It results in gridlock, so to say. But movementization as such is only a form of mobilization, I would argue. It's not necessarily or inherently anti-democratic. So then the question becomes, when do these populist radical right parties represent a threat to democracy? When does this become kind of a threat for democracy? And here I would like to play a bit with this distinction between anti-establishment and anti-pluralism. So anti-establishment, it's a populist type of claim, but it is very much rooted in an opposition against the incumbent. It is essentially saying, criticizes the incumbents, and of course it's still populist, so it's not saying, we should do this or that in policy terms. It still asks who is governing, and it's still kind of this personalization of politics, but it is arguably much more compatible with democratic competition than this anti-pluralist type of populist mobilization. What this means is that the populist radical right party or the populist party stands and says, I am the exclusive representative of the people, treats opposition as illegitimate and corrodes democratic competition. So in this sense, the threat to democracy runs through anti-pluralism. And it runs through, importantly, nativism. We are the sole representative of the nation, of the people, of the ethnic majority, ultimately, and of authoritarianism. Social disorder is undemocratic. We have to kind of stigmatize, punish, persecute any kind of deviance from the social order. And it is kind of this host ideology, not necessarily populism as such, that becomes kind of anti-democratic or a threat to democracy. Now, what happens when these parties come to govern? What is kind of the democratic conception that we live here? And what we see here, what this literature also very strongly talks about, is democratic backsliding, the gradual kind of corrosion of democracy. It's not necessarily in the form of a coup. It's not that a military general goes into TV and says, from now on it's an authoritarian system and then there are no elections. It's much more that there is kind of a gradual takeover of the institutional system, of the courts, of the media. The electoral rules are changed, civil society is taken over, and so on. And this is especially dangerous or especially visible, so to say, when these populist radical right parties govern alone. So here institutions are very important. If it's a proportional system, for example, that forces compromise where only coalitions can govern, this is a much more effective antidote against democratic backsliding than a majoritarian system where populist radical right parties govern alone and rule kind of governments as a single party. I brought you, for example, a figure here from the so-called VDEM dataset, where political scientists or social scientists are asked to score the extent to which their country or the country they have expertise about lives up to some ideas of democracy. And these are composite indexes that come from many different components. One such index is the liberal democracy index. To what extent does this country correspond to something that we would imagine as a liberal democracy in the sense of giving minority rights, checks and balances, having free and fair elections, fair courts, public media that allows to have debates and so on. And I brought here the line for 4 countries. Germany is the pink, the green is the US, Poland is the blue, and the orange is Hungary. And I brought it only from 2008 because according to this index, these countries have all kind of lived up to this conception of liberal democracy to a similar extent until 2008, until the so-called Great Recession. Now, when these parties come to govern, for example, in Hungary in 2010, you already see kind of a decline of Hungarian kind of liberal democracy before 2010, but after the Fidesz government, you see this fastening in decline of Hungarian democracy. And this is kind of a very spectacular, kind of gradual decline in the course of 15 years or 16 years that creates kind of a country that had a similar level of liberal democracy, not in terms of quality, but in terms of kind of living up to the minimal expectations what this liberal democracy should look like, as the US kind of, halving that score, whatever that means. We also see the same or similar developments in Poland, although kind of in Poland it bounces back after Civic Platform loses the election and Law and Justice comes to govern in 2023. But we see that this bouncing back, rebuilding of institutions is not that easy. It's not as easy as destroying institutions. It's a much longer and much more gradual process. And we now also see a very fast decline in the US under Trump. But of course, this is only a very short time series, but the kind of speed of decline is worrisome, I would say. And I also brought the German example because one should see, I think, a case where this is more or less stable. Of course, it doesn't mean that there are no problems with German democracy. I would not claim that. But compared to the other cases, in a country where these populist radical right parties are not governing alone, or in a government that they control more or less alone, like in Poland, the Law and Justice did, this is much more difficult to do. It's much more difficult to achieve this kind of democratic erosion. Now, it's not only that these anti-pluralist incumbents capture institutions, they also re-engineer the conflict. It has very strong implications for the type of conflict that we see in this society. And what we see is keeping the cultural cleavage, keeping the cultural issues, the so-called identity issues, this Galtan conflict, very much salient and very much in the center of political competition. In a way, to crowd out all kind of class-based discussion, redistributive issues, economic issues. They are marginalized. We also see that especially under such an anti-pluralist, populist, radical right incumbent, high polarization, but this polarization is not kind of mobilizing. On the contrary, in these cases, in the Hungarian, the Polish, we'll see now how it will be in the US case, but in these cases it was very much demobilizing. It created fatigue in the electorate, it created fragmentation in the party system, opposition totally fragmented in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, totally fragmented, and it very much relied on intimidation of the electorate from a state power. So it was very much demobilizing. So in this context, democratic backsliding reshaped not only kind of the institutional kind of structure of the regime, but also the conflict itself in which the party system is embedded in, or the issues on which the parties compete. So what are kind of stories for resilience? How can we what is kind of the resilient democracy here? I would argue a more positive message that recent examples, the Polish election in 2023 or the Hungarian election this year, shows that this type of incumbents, even these anti-pluralist, populist, radical right incumbents, can be defeated. The question is, though, what are the lessons that we can learn from these cases? And I brought here 3 mechanisms that I think are important for defeating these incumbents. One is, I would say, focusing on cross-cutting issues, issues that bring people together, even in a very polarized party system. And on valence issues, their competence is very important as kind of, in the eyes of the voter, to decide who to vote for. And this, for example, in the Polish and the Hungarian case, and now we increasingly see also in the Democrats in the US, is very much anti-corruption as a key message. And it's very much kind of weaving together grievances related to the public services that the state provides into a coherent electoral program. Grievances about education, healthcare, infrastructure, weaving them together into a coherent electoral program as a key to success. The second thing I would say is being close to citizens, bringing conflict to the local level, giving participation opportunities, relying on volunteers, getting kind of as many people into the conflict, into the party, into the kind of cause as possible, locally embedded mobilization. And the third, I would say, is direct contact, bypassing captured media. We see that also increasingly in the US, but we definitely saw that in Hungary and in Poland. What happens when the state or when the ruling party occupies the media, where the opposition does not get a voice in the media, and it is only indirectly talked about in smear campaigns. And what that makes, how difficult that makes to actually mobilize. And in this kind of context, digital type of communication. In the Hungarian case, for example, through Facebook, in other cases through other type of social media, has been incredibly important to bypass these controlled media outlets and this type of hostile media shows, to talk to the electorate in a more direct way. But of course, it's easier to win elections than restore regimes. Regime repair, institutional repair takes a long time, especially in these cases where democratic backsliding have been so corrosive. So what can we conclude from here? What are the key takeaway messages? I would like to formulate 3 of these messages. One, I would say, is an understanding of the populist radical right parties when they articulate an existing cleavage. They don't just kind of rely on protest, but they are socioeconomically embedded. So in this perspective, banning these parties misses the sociological roots why they persist. The second thing I would like to emphasize is the importance of this anti-pluralism for democratic threat, especially in combination with nativism and authoritarianism. It's not populism as such that is a threat to democracy, but it's very much the host ideology that these parties represent: nativism, authoritarianism, anti-pluralism. The third thing I would like to mention is the importance of political institutions and the form of mobilization for democratic resilience. Movementization is important both for the populist radical right, but also to defeat these forces, kind of locally embedded conflict. And of course, institutions are kind of the cushion, so to say, that they provide some kind of defense against democratic backsliding, but institutional repair takes a long time. So institutions are hard to change. They have a massive inertia. And of course, it's not so nice to finish a talk like this with an open question, but there is an open question that is the future here. And I think I see 2 trajectories. One trajectory would be that it is actually a temporary phenomenon. Contemporary populism will fade, especially as the new cleavage institutionalizes, as these challenger parties, like the populist radical right on the TAN part and the Green parties on the GAL part, as they join government, as they get governmental responsibilities, populism as a mobilization device will lose from its importance, and it's a transitory phenomenon that will disappear. The second kind of much more worrisome scenario is that these parties are not so quote-unquote normal parties, that they entrench themselves if they come to govern and they shape institutions to their image, leading to kind of regime change, leading to democratic backsliding, democratic kind of erosion of the institutional system. I don't know what is the answer to this, but I think these are 2 trajectories that one could think about in the present moment in Europe. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments.